I want to begin by thanking you for inviting me to give this keynote. I am very impressed with the great job the conference abstracts do in pointing out three important aspects of gender regimes: the institutional arrangements of families, the varying role of gender in organizing state politics, and how the links between families and states change the exercise of power across a variety of institutional sites over time. This conference is also very timely. Current populist movements take the observable changes in these institutional arrangements as threats to families and to the nation state. These political actors use demographic panic to both racialize the boundaries of nation states and to defend the gender binary as a natural, essential feature of social reproduction. My talk today focuses on the demographic roots of the democratic crisis and attempts to show how changes in reproductive relations are not only threats seen by the populist right, but opportunities for democracies to become more democratic. The storms of the present moment in Europe as well as the US make it impossible to ignore contestations over both gender and national identity as features of modern politics. However, nationalisms and their threats to democracy, and the mobilizations against gender and sexual diversity focused on families, are not always recognized as connected. Resisting nationalism is commonly understood as a conventionally political defense of democratic institutions. By contrast, contestations around the family are often framed as a culture war based on identities rather than institutions. This separation into two different kinds of crisis ignores the historical entanglements of family with nation as institutions that serve together as systems of inclusion and exclusion. Both have changed over time, but reconstructed each other in the period of industrialization, urbanization, and democratic revolutions that I am calling modernity. A nuclear, monogamous relationship centered on marital partners and a liberal democratic nation state are the forms of institutions that modernity generated and that became hegemonic in Western Europe and North America in the decade after World War II. The word tradition, however, is a poor representation of these modern families and nation states. Tradition ignores how they supported each other institutionally and normatively in changing. I suggest that we think of these as conventional ways modern people in modern nations view gender, family, and nation, conventional rather than traditional. Gender arrangements in families and nations are features of the body politic, which are designed together to be institutions that provide domestic security for the demos, the Greek word for population that is the root of domesticity, democracy, and demography. Demographic change has focused political attention on families and nations reproducing material populations and mapping them into the imagined communities of nations. Politicians and movements today are struggling over the boundaries of this demos itself. Demographic changes focus attention on children and the future survival of the demos, and undo the connections between family and nation that had once been experienced as natural. Overt feelings of insecurity have risen. States are called upon to remake how policies and practices govern gendered institutions. Historically, this is how monarchies became democracies, but also how women became mothers responsible for maintaining a reservoir of care in the home when capitalism began to seriously threaten it. Today's conflicts focus on gendered, racialized, and generational differences being remade under the conditions of current demographic change. On the one side, we have the fears of losing the conventional means of control over reproductive relations, expressed in the loss of citizen men's access to a family-supporting wage, and highly industrialized states coping with the shrinking of their national labor forces. This populist anxiety is expressed in rhetoric about protecting children, delegitimizing same-sex relationships and parenting, and sustaining the myth of the gender binary, as well as reducing immigration, resisting racial integration into the nation, and protecting national sovereignty. On the other side, we have people marginalized and excluded from the demos, seeing new options for making families, sharing the labor of producing the next generation, and participating in national projects. These changes reimagine a more inclusive family and nation in ways that go beyond gender equality measures already achieved in national legislatures, economies, and educational institutions. As a brief overview, let me tell you how I see this. Reproduction is, of course, always a social relation, not just a biological one. I'm using the term modern to describe the period following the democratic revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries that were both causes and effects of modern political and reproductive relations. The first part of this talk outlines how families and states collaborated in creating an institutional system empowering men, organized around mutual support for men's breadwinning and men's brotherhoods rather than classical patriarchy. In these liberal democracies, successful struggles for more inclusive participation in the institutions of the nation state have triggered a cascade of micro-level family changes. This in turn has led to macro-level challenges to how nation states can manage their reproduction. In my second part, I consider the challenges to the gender and racial ethnic hierarchies that liberal democracies institutionalized in their families and nation states. Arising first in the 1960s, the New Left generation identified contradictions in the breadwinner brotherhood standard of modernity, including its persistent exclusions of women, its heteronormative understanding of sexuality confined to marriage, its racial biases based on a colonial imaginary in which colonies were the dependents of imperial states. Racial biases were also involved in the peace-endangering focus on male-led states and individual men as competitors. The economic opportunities for women and non-nationals created in the 1960s distanced the modern definition of family as a single household dependent on a male breadwinner from how the next generation needed and wanted families to work for them. The institutionalization of state welfare policies assuming a breadwinner brotherhood family were challenged by the diversity of real families now, and immigration policies that had attempted to preserve an imagined racial ethnic brotherhood were at odds with how nation states needed to grow their labor forces in the global economy. In short, the unities of family with nation and nation with state, presumed in the 1950s, unraveled in the 1970s to 1990s, as economic, technological, and political changes undercut the breadwinner brotherhood model, and social movements emerged to point out these contradictions. My final section describes how a new left and a populist new right have emerged in different ways into the specific party systems institutionalized in liberal democracies. The old left-right partisan conflict was centered on control over production and how the benefits of economic growth should be shared between capital and labor. A new left and a new right are now fighting over the demise of modernity as it had been institutionalized in the 1950s family, in the Cold War between socialism and Western democracies, and in racialized colonial dependencies. These breadwinner brotherhood politics began to be overtaken in the 21st century by a new and therefore what I call post-modern set of conflicts, as demographic changes in population sizes and composition became more central to the needs of families and states facing increasingly global challenges. So let me turn to develop this first point. Modern states are not classically patriarchal. Since the 18th and 19th century revolutions that demanded democracy as a political form also changed the premises of families. Patriarchs had ruled by descent and with arbitrary power over extended families, clans, and empires, using women to cement ties among descent groups. But the new family relations of liberal democracy were grounded in capitalist economies, where wage-earning men carried responsibilities for breadwinning for increasingly nuclear families, and men in the brotherhoods democratically negotiated what responsibilities states had for reproducing their families. I call the family-state relationship that emerged a breadwinner brotherhood regime. This modern organization of gender assigned men and masculinity the collective right to represent democratic publics and excluded women and men from outside the brotherhood group from exercising the opportunities to access jobs that would provide them with breadwinner status in their families. Neither a nuclear family nor a nation state could be institutionalized as normative standards without the development of other modern organizations like corporations, unions, legislatures, and newspapers. Such gendered institutions offered empowerment to men as adult peers entitled to exercise collective power as what I call brothers, and they offered familial power by virtue of the economic provision husbands were now legally bound to offer. A new way of justifying women's exclusion from the decision-making public was also developed, one that prioritized women's imputed difference rather than their inferiority to men. Separate spheres ideology supposedly divided the new male collective public from a so-called private, a domestic domain of women as mothers subordinated to a wage earner. Consequent struggles to empower mothers as mothers and to free women from confinement to the domestic characterized the gender politics of the 1850s to 1960s. By 1990, however, I suggest that these struggles for gender equality with men of the same class, race, and nation were largely won. Women's access to authority was institutionalized in what we are now beginning to recognize as a post-patriarchal modernity, to the extent that this modern gender regime of breadwinner families and national brotherhoods is removed from history and presented as natural. Its persistent gender and race inequalities are naturalized as well. However, the demography of both families and states continued to change. Even these modern breadwinner brotherhood relations came to seem old-fashioned. Today, they're often misleadingly called traditional. They're conventional rather than traditional because they are increasingly inadequate for the demographic present, but nonetheless conventions that people feel ought to be followed. In many ways, however, we are no longer modern. This slide begins to account for some of the ways in which we are no longer living in the breadwinner brotherhood regime. Age at marriage, here illustrated with the US Census in decades up to 1950, and in accelerating annual increases since then, has now risen to unprecedented heights. Consequently, fertility rates for industrialized countries have dropped below replacement levels. The dual earner family has become more typical than the single breadwinner male-headed household, but the demands for capital and labor investments in raising each child have increased too. The result is both role conflict for mothers and increased political demand for fathers to do more care work. Destigmatized divorce has allowed for serial monogamy to replace the nuclear family, with complex and extended blends of step-sibs and step-parents becoming normal. The gap between the age at puberty and age at first marriage has grown so large that non-marital cohabitation had also to be normalized, making the rules of sexual intimacy and love no longer so dependent on gender difference. Given declining fertility and age of mortality, and rising age of mortality, care is needed for elders as well as children. It's more often sourced from outside family-based households, with marketized provision and transnational providers of care becoming increasingly typical. The end of the breadwinner brotherhood model of modernity has also challenged nation-state policymakers in a variety of ways. This slide focuses on the changes that are arising from the ways in which family relations are no longer modern, and technologies have intervened to increase options for new kinds of reproductive relations. As women have moved intentionally into more powerful political and economic roles, they have also exercised leadership in bringing their reproductive costs and freedoms into legislative and popular debates. The technological advances like the contraceptive pill, longer-lasting implants, and Plan B for post-sex protection have offered women more control over becoming pregnant, and both surgical and medical abortions are now reliable and safer than giving birth. Ever since Louise Brown became the first test tube baby in 1979, the proliferation of assisted reproductive technologies has allowed women to overcome fertility constraints and people of any gender to seek out surrogates to carry children for them. States have to decide which of these reproductive alternatives to regulate and how. It is not just childbirth, but the whole process of raising children that is no longer tied to separate spheres for husbands and wives, since family roles are now legally delinked from a gender binary in heterosexual marriages. In the US and many other industrialized countries, either partner can collect state benefits as a dependent or be required to pay alimony and child support as a breadwinner. The drop in fertility below replacement also puts states in the position of finding new sources of labor to sustain and grow their GDP. Immigration is obviously one way of meeting this reproductive need. It separates the interests of brotherhood-defined nation from those of the state and its management of the political economy. The postmodern demos is less national and older. The aging of populations is a demographic fact that requires states to rethink how they will manage the demos of their future democracy. Who can become a citizen is a challenge when populations are more mobile than ever before. Moreover, the post-World War II international order was itself a challenge to the breadwinner brotherhood relations of rivalrous states democratically responsible for and wholly sovereign over each respective demos. The devastation of the war itself promoted a rethinking of brotherhood too. Transnational policies to protect individuals outside of the kinds of security that membership in nation states was supposed to, but failed to provide, was one particular way that a postmodern immigration regime developed, driven by claims for asylum and refuge from war and devastation. The borders that nation states understood as sources of war were reconstructed in Europe through various global sets of treaties and state memberships, from the UN to NATO to the World Trade Organization and to the law of the sea, all of which attempted to limit dangerous kinds of state competition. The dismantling of colonial empires brought a surge of new nation-states into existence, and immigration flows from racialized colonies into the metropole helped keep the population up, but did not automatically change restrictive ideas of national citizenship. Other labor needs, including for caregivers outside the modern nuclear family, also reshaped immigration and created transnational familial connections between sending and receiving nations. Overall, the 1950s marked the high point of the breadwinner brotherhood regime in both families and states, and all of the changes from that point on suggest a need for a different way of thinking about gender, power, and state as organized. Yet they do not offer a single hegemonic model of what the new regime should be. As the institutional dominance of the breadwinner brotherhood regime of modernity has declined, new patterns of practice in families and states have proliferated. The prevalence of all-white, all-male institutions decreased beginning in the last decades of the 20th century, and less national, less gender binary patterns emerged in the first quarter of the 21st. I consider this period of transition to postmodern politics as ones that no longer conform to a breadwinner brotherhood template for nation states, built on a gender binary separation of public and private spheres. I use this term postmodern not to describe a point of view or even a particular set of new normative standards, but rather as a descriptor, a simple descriptor of the patterns of gender and racial practice increasingly evident in the 21st century. Gendered and racial power arrangements in families, nations, states often no longer reflect the once hegemonic breadwinner brotherhood relations of modernity. A vivid illustration of this can be found in the inaugural photo of Amy Coney Barrett, appointed by President Trump to be a highly conservative justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. That she is also the mother of 7 children, 2 of them internationally and interracially adopted, is applauded by conservatives, even though this is very inconsistent with the ideal of separate spheres. Her anti-reproductive rights politics are actually depicted as consistent with her public leadership role, indicating that women's opportunities in the public sphere are not being problematized by even extreme forms of motherhood, and the, again, normatively acceptable reliance on domestic help. Similarly, the picture of Rishi Sunak and his wife, as he was confirmed as the first Prime Minister of Indian heritage in Britain, points to a wider and more economically drawn basis for political power. He rose to his position as part of a wealthy, transnational family with an elite education in Britain, coincidentally following a 3rd woman in the role of Prime Minister. Even in the conservative parties of the US and Great Britain, therefore, formal political power in states does not follow the rules that modernity had set for families and nations. The consequences of geographies of immigration, a less gender binary economy, and new reproductive technologies fall in distinct intersectional patterns that the 21st century is presenting us with. All of these changes together in the 21st century are what I call the postmodern condition for doing politics and exercising power. And they are conditions in which the limits of liberal democracies can be both seen and contested. So, I'm now shifting to the last portion of the talk And I want to suggest some of the ways in which breadwinner brotherhood values associated with modern families and liberal democratic nation states are being remapped onto a different axis of partisan conflict. This slide points to how the so-called family values undergirding the breadwinner brotherhood regime in modernity, once expressed in partisan struggles between right and left, have become converted into new claims for the power to define what rules will govern postmodern coalitions. The old right represented more classically patriarchal models of family and state. They relied on religious authority and control over capital, and it was challenged by the modern left, the liberal, socialist, and social democratic parties that affirmed modern breadwinner brotherhood relations as normatively appropriate. And they sought to use states to realize protections for men's labor and women's domesticity that this regime called for. Modernity was advanced from this old left in terms that institutionalized the gender binary protectionist welfare state and empowered the national brotherhoods of unions and legislatures over corporations and executives. But in the postmodern conditions of the 21st century, protecting national sovereignty from limits imposed by treaties and global rights regimes is no longer the priority of the old right, where corporate power is global and religions act transnationally to empower their adherents. The new right recognizes the breadwinner brotherhood regime as declining in force and presents this as a danger to families and nations that must be stopped by turning the state's power to these ends. States are to prevent immigration from those outside the borders of brotherhood and repress any view of families and intimacies that do not preserve a gender binary by force of law. The politics of the postmodern condition, however, does allow a wide variety of imagined alternatives to the stultifying breadwinner brotherhood template. These tend to cluster into what I'm calling a new left. These movements and parties where they recruit support are eclectic and diverse, but they often share a core principle of autonomy, reimagined in terms that are not limited by the masculinized history that liberal democracy and its breadwinner-supported nuclear family produced. The classic old left and the classic old right of breadwinner brotherhood modernity have remained strongly institutionalized as a dimension of conflict in nation-state politics. Legislative battles are often cast in these familiar, modern terms of left and right, meaning parties on the left that are more protective of breadwinner families and their labors, and parties on the right arguing for fewer restrictions on capital, including dropping some of modernity's hard-won protection. Doom battles are emerging, however, on a second, reproductive axis. On this axis, new models for states are offered to follow in creating a new demos from the patterns of postmodern life. The classical left still does argue for a principle of equality, but its economic-centered egalitarianism is relatively blind to the privileges and power that were institutionalized in modernity's definition of gendered and racialized differences as being legitimate inequalities. The new left, by contrast, tends to define educational inequalities and some of the differences in income and wealth tied to these as being meritocratic rather than problematic, as the old left had. It focuses on critiquing the biases apparent in the postmodern era, pointing to the racial, gender, and sexual exclusions of liberal democracy that are part of its modern breadwinner brotherhood foundations. The classic right values hierarchy, seeing in it an expression of merit through both familial descent and capital accumulation. which indeed the development of modernity made to overlap significantly in practice. Relative to these, educational hierarchies are trivialized as postmodern elitism. I'll discuss more about the new right later, but let me point out that neither the new left nor the new right have fully consolidated their interests into being a single agenda. They are responding broadly to the contradictions between breadwinner brotherhood institutions and the state actions that respond to challenges posed by postmodern demographic relations. As intersectional coalitions, both ends of the new reproductive dimension are distinct from the old one, both in how their adherents and political claims come together, but also in how each end is coherently different from the other in the constituencies that they mobilize. The new dimension differentiates along the lines of how urban, how highly educated, how young, how geographically mobile, and how transnationally connected their participants are. The new left claims for justice moves the classic left claim for equality towards critiques of privilege that modernity had naturalized in the form of its gender binaries and national borders. The new right, by contrast, moves states toward policies to advance and maintain the modern order of families and nations, rather than to seek or protect corporate profits, as the classic right has done. Both the new left and the new right are anti-globalization and critical of transnational capitalism as a driver of institutional change. But the new right takes a stance of aggrieved entitlement to the changes postmodern relations imply, seeing in them only loss and threat. Yet to defend the embedded inclusions that privileged men in the workplace and women in families is not to defend tradition, but to stand up for the conventions of modernity that emerged along with capitalism, the capitalism that they critique. The new right's narrative of the kinds of dangers it sees in the postmodern conditions of the 21st century reflect its members' intersectional anxieties. The voices of the new right are therefore diverse. First, it is clear that this new right speaks the language of populism. Populists speak for the people of the demos, presenting modernity's old gender regime, called family values, as being in need of defense. Global elites are seen as the source of the equal rights projects that prioritize education over skin color, place women in power over men of their families or nations, and invest in mobility experiences over sustaining multi-generational rootedness in local communities. The new right sees this as endangering the continuity of the demos. The rhetoric of the populist right emphasizes defending children, by which they mean keeping them innocent of sexual or racial knowledge. The defense of the gender binary is explicitly tied to breadwinning and caregiving on this new right. These are premised on defending a reservoir of private care against public capitalism. The right invokes religious values to advocate for state mandates that will explicitly reaffirm the complementarity of women and men. And so it argues strongly against same-sex relationships and marriages. Religion is broadly mobilized to vigorously resist gender equality politics, gender studies, and an invented ideology it calls genderism. The Catholic Church has been a major player in how the new right views the hegemonic gender binary of modernity. It envisions Christianity now as a brotherhood relationship uniting all the West. This religiously understood West was initially opposed to the East of Cold War socialism, but is now defined by its modernity relative to the classically patriarchal East of Islamic states. The Catholic Church, an old right institution once preaching classical patriarchal views of women's innate inferiority and dangerous sexuality, has modernized its doctrines to affirm the modern gender binary. Now claiming that complementary difference is ordained by God, the Church spearheads transnational and local mobilizations, opposing all non-binary forms of gender and non-heterosexual types of families, while falsely claiming that this is what we have always taught. Racial and religious hierarchies are invoked to highlight the shrinkage in the reproduction of once dominant population groups, but this is attributed to intentional conspiracies rather than to the postmodern condition as such. Selective pronatalism is combined with exclusionary xenophobia to advocate a conventionally bordered nation-state that profits from labor extracted from people of all nations, while offering modern welfare benefits only to those families of the right composition and ethnicity. In terms of the demos entrusted to the state, conventionally bordered nation-states are also seen as treacherously surrendering their sovereign power to the international regime of multinational institutions and treaties. The U.S. still resists ratifying treaties that would make it accountable internationally for discrimination against women, for example in CEDAW, or for the physical or sexual abuse of children. Brexit expressed how far the right would go in rejecting such EU directives and norms, and the German alternative for Germany also started out as a party oriented against the EU. In other words, if we keep our eye on the connections among family, nation, and state that are no longer institutionalized in modern terms, we can see that the new right is mounting a multi-pronged defense of all of the biases and exclusions that limited modern liberal democracies. They, however, are not unified in thinking about what would have to change in what order in order to undo the postmodern condition. Efforts that they would have to undo the postmodern condition would demand changing relations over which the new right actually has no control. It can't create breadwinning jobs for men or stop the economic and climate crises that are generating migrations. What then can it do? It can complain. And it can attempt to use the law to block responses that would adjust modern states or to postmodern conditions. As this slide suggests, reactions to demographic changes that deinstitutionalize breadwinners and brotherhoods can actually be positive, even enthusiastic, emphasizing what marginalized and excluded people see as the promises rather than the threats in the transition. The postmodern condition is one in which partnership matters, both among members of families and among the nation states that share our single planet. A participatory standard for democracy would begin to eliminate the hierarchies that liberal democracy assumed, being a system, liberal democracy being a system that had been designed by and for adult men alone. Democracy's modern breadwinner brotherhood regime most notably accepted gender, race, and ethnicities as naturalized inequalities, and thus has state by state failed to meet crises effectively. The pandemic is a great example of how a reproductive crisis evokes the modern normative standard, but in a condition of postmodernity. Whether or not existing women leaders were better policymakers as individuals is not my question, but rather Why is it that democratic states followed the example of authoritarian ones and failed to consult with and engage their whole populations in making decisions about what should be done? Participatory democracies might instead have included experiences and insights won across national borders and sexual and racial differences, taking the opportunity to learn from LGBT experiences in the early years of the HIV/AIDS epidemic and from African experiences with Ebola and other dangerous diseases. White, highly educated men, either as technocratic experts or political elites, instead dominated the institutional levers of shared action. And populists then exploited distrust of them to build their own power over the demos. Powerful nations responded to the crisis by appropriating even more of the skilled labor that other nations had reproduced. However, this is a missed opportunity. Anxiety need not lead to fear-mongering if people of all genders, races, sexualities, and nations are better incorporated into processes of collective decision-making. This is important because the kinds of problems that recent generations are called upon to solve are truly global ones, the pandemic being only the first. Survival of the national demos cannot be separated from the survival of humanity as a whole in the face of nuclear war or climate catastrophe. The modern habit of turning to national legislatures and technocrats as if they epitomize democracy may, as the pandemic demonstrated, draw on too little of the imagination and commitment of the demos as a whole. Partnership and participation as foundations for more democratic democracies challenge the built-in exclusions of liberal democracy and its understanding of rights and citizenship. This is something about which the once excluded may rejoice, but they also offer a positive route to addressing the postmodern conditions of life as a whole. Because the generations coming of age now are those born in the postmodern conditions of the 21st century, I'm optimistic about their contributions in moving the demos of many nation states away from a breadwinner brotherhood version of democracy and toward a degendered participatory partnership regime in the course of time. Given the pressing nature of the problems of the planet, I'm unsure about whether we collectively have enough time to complete this great transition to a new gender order. I am, however, quite optimistic that each new generation will form its aspirations in the more inclusive and less unequal reproductive regimes that they experience themselves. These will now be seen and experienced as normal, even hegemonic, by these generations. And in that, I see hope for a new, democratic, inclusive postmodernity. Thank you. Thank you very much for offering me this opportunity to do this as a remote talk, though as you can tell, I am not practiced in this.